Humans have been waging war against one another since the first records of civilization have come to light, waged over the pettiest infractions like an insult to a family name to serious offenses of undeclared raids on your settlements. So death and destruction is no foreign concept to humanity. However, there comes a time where it becomes too much. Too many family members, too many enemies, too much blood tainting the crops, too many tears flooding the rivers, and too many corpses to bury. Through the centuries of warring, technologies advanced, leading to advancements in killing. From spears, cannons, rifles, bombs, to lethal chemicals. In the 20th century, humanity reached a point of efficient lethality that the concern of the human race was of real worry. This essay will run through the most impactful events of genocide, mass slaughter, and war that occurred during the 1900s. Some of the events you may have heard of, some not, but you've been warned as we count and estimate death toll for this century of genocide. By the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing under internal division, nationalism, and military decline. As fear spread through the empire's leadership, suspicion turned toward Christian Armenian minorities living within the Ottoman territory. The government increasingly portrayed Armenians not as citizens but as a threat. Newspapers, officials, and political leaders framed them as disloyal outsiders, undermining the state from within. That transformation from neighbor to enemy is the first step in nearly every genocide. In 1915, mass deportations began. Armenian intellectuals were arrested first, then entire villages were emptied. Men were executed, women, children, and the elderly were forced into death marches across the Syrian desert with little food or water. Many died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, or outright massacre along the roads. By the end, as many as 1 to 1.5 million Armenians were dead. The world watched the destruction unfold through scattered reports and photographs. But the machinery of international intervention barely existed. The genocide became one of the first demonstrations of how modern states could systematically erase populations while the outside world hesitated. Years later, Adolf Hitler would reportedly reference the silence surrounding the Armenians when discussing his own plans for Europe. History had already taught a dangerous lesson. The world often moves on. The Greek Genocide, the erasure of Asia Minor's ancient Greeks. For nearly thousands of years, Greek communities had lived along the western coast of Anatolia and throughout the Black Sea region. Long before the rise of the Ottoman Empire, these cities were centers of commerce, philosophy, and early Christianity. As the Ottoman Empire entered its final years, those ancient communities increasingly became targets of persecution. During the First World War and the chaotic years that followed, hundreds of thousands of Greeks were deported from their homes, forced into labor battalions, or marched into the interior under brutal conditions. Entire villages were emptied, churches destroyed, and families separated. The violence reached its climax during the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 through 1922, culminating in the destruction of Smyrna, one of the largest Greek cities in Asia Minor. Fires consumed much of the city while civilians desperately searched for escape along the harbor. By the war's end, the centuries-old Greek presence in Anatolia had effectively come to an end. For many historians, the Greek genocide forms part of a broader campaign against the Ottoman Empire's Christian minorities. Alongside the Armenian and Assyrian genocides, together they marked the violent transformation of a multi-ethnic empire into a more homogeneous nation-state. The Assyrian Genocide, the disappearance of an ancient people. Long before Rome rose to power, long before the birth of Christianity, the Assyrians had already built one of history's earliest civilizations. Though their empire disappeared thousands of years ago, Assyrian communities endured throughout Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia, preserving their language, culture, and Christian faith. During the First World War, however, these communities became caught in the same wave of violence that engulfed Armenians and Greeks. Accused of collaborating with Russia and viewed with suspicion by Ottoman authorities, Assyrian villages were attacked, churches destroyed, and civilians massacred or forced to flee. Many survivors escaped into Persia or neighboring regions, while others perished during forced marches, famine, and attacks on refugee columns. Ancient settlements that had survived for centuries disappeared within only a few years. Unlike the Armenian Genocide, the Assyrian Genocide remains relatively unknown outside of academic circles, yet for the Assyrian people, remembered as Sappho, or the sword, it represents one of the defining tragedies of their history and a devastating blow to one of the world's oldest continuous cultures. After World War I, Germany collapsed into humiliation, economic disaster, and political extremism. Amid fear and instability, the Nazi Party rose by promising national rebirth while blaming minorities, especially the Jews, for the nation's suffering. Hatred became policy. What made the Holocaust uniquely terrifying was not merely its scale, but its organization. This was not random mob violence, it was bureaucracy. Train schedules, census records, industrial chemicals, filing system, engineers, architects. Factories of death operating with mechanical precision. Entire populations were categorized, transported, exported, and exterminated through systems designed by one of the most educated societies on earth. Jews across Europe were forced into ghettos before being deported to concentration camps and extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Others were murdered by mobile killing squads in forests and ravines throughout Eastern Europe. Around 4 to 6 million Jews were killed. Millions of others, including Romani people, disabled individuals, Slavs, political dissidents, and homosexuals, were also targeted and murdered. The Holocaust shattered the illusion that civilization alone could restrain evil. Germany was not an ancient barbarian kingdom. It was a modern, industrial, scientific, and yet beneath its technological sophistication emerged one of history's darkest crimes. The camps revealed something horrifying. Human progress and human morality are not the same thing. The post-war expulsion of ethnic Germans. Vengeance after victory. The defeat of Nazi Germany ended one of history's greatest crimes, but for millions of ordinary German civilians living outside of Germany's new borders, peace did not immediately bring safety. As the war ended, ethnic Germans living in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and other parts of Eastern Europe were expelled on a massive scale. Entire communities that had lived in these regions for generations were forced from their homes. Many were given little time to gather belongings before beginning their long journeys westward. The expulsions were accompanied by acts of violence, disease, starvation, internment, and revenge killings. Thousands died during forced marches or in overcrowded camps, while millions lost their homes and livelihoods. Historians estimate that between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were displaced, making one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. The legal and historical interpretation of these events remains debated. While they are widely recognized as mass expulsions accompanied by serious human rights abuses and significant civilian deaths, most historians do not classify the overall expulsion as a genocide. The tragedy illustrates one of history's most uncomfortable realities. When great wars end, violence often does not end with them. For countless civilians, the conclusion of one atrocity became the beginning of another. Building a new world. In 1917, the Russian Revolution promised something unprecedented. The old aristocracy was gone. The monarchy had fallen. The Bolsheviks claimed they would build a new society free from exploitation, inequality, and oppression. To millions around the world, it appeared to be the future. To its leaders, however, the future required sacrifice, and sacrifice would soon be measured in millions of lives. Not all genocide emerged through racial ideology alone. Some emerged through political fanaticism and absolute state control. Under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union embarked on one of the most ambitious social engineering projects in human history. In Ukraine, forced grain seizures combined with impossible production quotas created catastrophic famine during the early 1930s. Villages emptied, families collapsed beside roads, children searched fields for scraps. Cannibalism appeared in some areas as starvation consumed entire regions. Whether viewed strictly as genocide or as mass political extermination through engineered famine, the result was the same. Millions dead beneath the authority of the modern state. At the same time, Stalin purges swept across the Soviet Union. Political enemies, intellectuals, military officers, and ordinary civilians disappeared into executions or labor camps known as the Gulag system. Fear itself became infrastructure. Neighbors informed on neighbors, loyalty became survival. The state no longer merely governed life, it governed reality itself. The Holodomor. Starvation as policy. In the fertile fields of Ukraine, disaster unfolded. For generations, Ukraine had been one of Europe's great agricultural regions. Its vast plains produced enormous quantities of grain, but under Stalin's collectivization policies, private farming was dismantled. Grain quotas became increasingly impossible to meet. Government officials seized food supplies. Villages were stripped of their harvest. Travel restrictions prevented many starving families from seeking help elsewhere. As famine spread, entire communities began to collapse. Parents watched children starve. Children watched parents die. Fields remained fertile, yet food disappeared from local tables. Witnesses described villages falling silent. No barking dogs, no livestock, no movement, only hunger. By the time the famine ended, millions were dead. Whether one view the Holodomor was genocide, a political engineered famine, or a combination of both, its human toll remains undeniable. It stands among the deadliest man-made disasters in modern history. Kazakhstan. The destruction of a nomadic world. While Ukraine starved, another catastrophe was unfolding farther east. For centuries, Kazakh society has been built around nomadic traditions. Entire communities move with their livestock across vast grasslands. Collectivization shattered that way of life. Livestock herds collapsed. Traditional economic system disappeared almost overnight. The result was one of the most devastating famines of the 20th century. Millions perished or fled. Some estimates suggest that nearly a third of the Kazakh population died or was displaced. Entire regions were transformed forever. The famine did not merely kill people, it dismantled a civilization. The Great Purge. The state turned inwards. A famine demonstrated the destructive power of ideology. The Great Purge demonstrated the destructive power of paranoia. During the late 1930s, Stalin increasingly viewed enemies everywhere. Party officials, military officers, intellectuals, factory managers, ordinary citizens. No one was completely safe. Arrests often came in the middle of the night. Families disappeared without warning. Confessions were extracted through coercion and torture. Show trials transformed politics into theater. Millions entered prison, labor camps, and execution sites. Many never returned. The Soviet state had created a system in which fear became a governing principle. The citizen no longer feared foreign enemies alone. The citizen feared the state itself. The deported nations, entire peoples uprooted. During the Second World War, Soviet authorities expanded repression beyond individuals. Entire ethnic groups became targets. Communities were accused of collaboration, disloyalty, or potential resistance. The punishment was collective. Families were awakened and given little time to gather belongings. Then came the trains. Hundreds of thousands of Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, Kalmyks, Barkars, Karachars, Koreans were located in the cattle cars and transported across vast distances. The journey was brutal, food was scarce, disease spread rapidly. Many died before reaching their destination. Others perished in exile, entire homelands were emptied, maps changed, villages vanished. Generations grew up far from the lands their ancestors had called home. The 20th century increasingly revealed a disturbing pattern. Modern governments possess the power not merely to govern populations, but to move them like pieces on a board. Katyn, a forest of silence. In 1940, thousands of Polish military officers, intellectuals, and officials disappeared. Families waited for letters that never arrived. Questions went unanswered. Rumors spread. Years later, mass graves were discovered in the forest near Katyn. The victims had been systematically executed, shot, one by one, buried in carefully prepared pits. For decades, responsibility remained politically contested. The massacre became more than a crime. It became a symbol, a reminder that truth itself can become a casualty of power. The Empire of the Rising Sun, Imperial Japan. While Europe marched toward Auschwitz and the Gulag, another storm was gathering in the east. For centuries, Japan had existed on the edge of Asia, relatively isolated from the great struggles that shaped the continent. But by the late 19th century, everything changed. Japan industrialized at extraordinary speed. Factories emerged, railways expanded, modern armies were built, warships filled its harbors. Within a few decades, Japan had transformed from a feudal society into one of the most powerful nations in the world. Yet modernization brought a problem. Unlike the great continental powers, Japan possessed limited natural resources. It lacked much of the oil, iron, coal, and raw materials needed to sustain an industrial empire. And in the age of nationalism and imperial competition, dependence was viewed as weakness. The solution, many Japanese leaders believed, was expansion. What began as ambition would evolve into one of the most destructive military campaigns of the 20th century. From Manchuria to Burma, from Shanghai to Manila, millions would find themselves trapped beneath the advancing banner of the rising sun. The invasion of China, the gateway of horror. The conflict that would eventually become part of the Second World War began years earlier in Asia. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria. Soon, military expansion accelerated. By 1937, full-scale war erupted between China and Japan. Cities became battlefields, entire regions descended into chaos. And with it, the war came a level of brutality that shocked even some contemporary observers. The violence was not merely military. Increasingly, civilians became targets. Distinction between soldier and civilian began to disappear. And nowhere would that become apparent than in one city, Nanjing. Nanjing, the rape of a capital. In December 1937, Japanese forces entered Nanjing, then the capital of China. What followed became one of the most infamous atrocities of the 20th century. For weeks, the city descended into terror. Civilians were rounded up, prisoners of war were executed, widespread rape occurred across the city, families were murdered in their homes, mass executions were carried out along riverbanks and open fields. Foreign witnesses document scenes of extraordinary brutality. Entire neighborhoods became zones of fear. Bodies accumulated in streets, rivers, and mass graves. The exact death toll remains debated among historians, but the scale of the massacre remains undeniable. Nanjing became a symbol, a warning of what could happen when military conquest becomes untethered from restraint. Yet Nanjing was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader pattern emerging across occupied Asia. Shanghai and the expansion of violence. Before Nanjing, the Battle of Shanghai had already demonstrated the immense destruction modern warfare could inflict upon urban populations. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Civilian casualties mounted. As Japanese forces advanced deeper into China, violence increasingly extended beyond military objectives. Occupation brought forced labor, reprisals, executions, and collective punishment. The war was becoming total. An entire population were paying the price. The three alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. As resistance intensified in northern China, Japanese forces adopted increasingly brutal counterinsurgency tactics. Among the most notorious was what became known as the three all policies: kill all, burn all, loot all. Entire villages suspected of supporting resistant movements could be destroyed. Homes burned, food supplies confiscated, communities emptied. The policy aimed to deny support to insurgents. In practice, it often devastated civilian populations. The countryside became a landscape of fear. Families found themselves trapped between occupying armies and resistant forces. The war was no longer simply about territory. It had become a struggle for survival. Massacres across China. The horrors extended far beyond Nanjing. Throughout occupied China, numerous massacres occurred as military operations intensified. At Chengzhou, civilians were killed during anti-resistance operations. At Panjshou, entire communities suffered devastating attacks. At Pingdingshan, civilians were systematically massacred following resistance activity. The Zhenghai and Jingxing campaign brought further destruction, particularly after American airmen involved in the Doolittle raid received assistance from Chinese civilians. Japanese reprisals targeted communities suspected of helping the attackers. Villages were destroyed, civilians were executed. Disease outbreaks followed military operations. Across vast regions of China, warfare blurred into atrocity. For many civilians, survival became a matter of chance. The Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere. Japanese leaders often describe their expansion as the creation of a new Asian order. Official propaganda spoke of liberation from Western colonialism. It promised cooperation among Asian people, a shared destiny, a prosperous future. The reality on the ground often looked very different. Occupied territories were expected to support Japan's war effort. Resources were extracted. Labor was mobilized. Dissent was crushed. For many communities, Japanese occupation simply replaced one form of domination with another. The rhetoric of liberation collided with the reality of military rule. The Philippines. The Bataan Death March. Following Japan's invasion of the Philippines, American and the Filipino forces eventually surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula. Thousands of prisoners were forced to march long distances under harsh conditions. Food and water were scarce. Beatings were common. Many prisoners died from exhaustion, disease, dehydration, or violence. The event became known as the Bataan Death March. For survivors, the experience left scars that lasted a lifetime. The march became one of the most recognized symbols of wartime brutality in the Pacific. Singapore. In Singapore, Japanese authorities launched a campaign aimed at eliminating individuals suspected of anti-Japanese activities. Known as Suk Ching, the operation targeted large numbers of ethnic Chinese residents. Men were screened, detained, and in many cases executed. Communities already traumatized by war now faced the fear of mass arrests and disappearances. The operation left a lasting wound in Singapore's collective memory, a reminder that occupation often carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. Burma and Malaya. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, atrocities accompanied military campaigns and occupation. At Katalogan in Burma, civilians were killed during operations against suspected resistance. At Peret Solong in Malay, prisoners and wounded soldiers were massacred after capture. Across the region, military objectives increasingly merged with collective punishment. Villages became targets, civilians became suspects, fear became routine. Indonesia in the Pacific, forced labor and occupation. Throughout occupied territories, millions were subjected to forced labor. Railroads were built, military infrastructure expanded, resources were extracted to sustain the Japanese war machine. Many laborers worked under brutal conditions. Disease, starvation, exhaustion, and abuse claimed countless lives. The war was being fought not only on battlefields but through the exploitation of civilian populations across vast distances. Manila, the destruction of a city. By 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing. American forces advanced across the Pacific. Cities once conquered now became battlegrounds again. In Manila, the capital of the Philippines, the final stages of the war produced one of the most devastating urban catastrophes in Asia. As fighting intensified, civilians found themselves trapped. Mass killings occurred, entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Artillery and urban combat compounded the devastation. When the battle ended, much of the city lay in ruins. Tens of thousands of civilians were dead. The liberation of Manila came at a terrible cost. Laha and Sandakan. Death at the end of an empire. As Japan's military situation deteriorated, conditions worsened for prisoners of war across the region. At Laha, prisoners were executed following capture. At Sandakan in Borneo, prisoners were forced on brutal marches through difficult terrain. Many died from starvation, disease, exhaustion, or mistreatment. By the final years of the war, suffering spread through both occupied populations and those held captive by the collapsing empire. The violence intensified even as defeat became inevitable. In August 1945, the war ended. Japan surrendered. Its empire vanished almost overnight. The rising sun that had once stretched across East and Southeast Asia receded back to the Japanese homelands. The destruction left behind was immense. Cities shattered, millions dead, entire populations traumatized. The atrocities committed across Asia revealed another recurring lesson of the 20th century: extreme nationalism, militarism, racial superiority. When the Second World War ended in 1945, much of the world believed a new era had begun. The Axis power had been defeated, the concentration camps had been liberated, the horrors of war had been exposed before a global audience. The phrase never again entered the international vocabulary. Yet beneath the celebration of victory, another struggle was already taking shape. Across Asia, old colonial empires were collapsing, new nations were being born. Revolutionary movements promised equality, independence, and national renewal. Millions hoped that the future would be different from the past, but throughout the second half of the 20th century, some of the deadliest atrocities in modern history would emerge not from imperial conquest alone, but from famine, ideology, revolution, and political fanaticism. The victims would once again be ordinary people: farmers, workers, students, families. Entire communities caught between competing visions of the future. Jallianwala Bagh, when an empire fired on its subjects. Although it occurred before the Second World War, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre would become one of the most defining moments of British rule in India. In April 19, thousands of civilians gathered in Amritsar. Some came to protest colonial policies, others simply attended a public gathering. The crowd was largely unarmed. Without warning, British troops under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer opened fire. The exits were limited, panic spread immediately. Men, women, and children attempted to escape. Many were trapped, hundreds were killed. Many more wounded. The massacre shocked India. For millions, it shattered any remaining belief that colonial rule could be reformed through cooperation alone. The event became a turning point in India's independence movement. It also revealed a recurring feature of modern history. Governments often justify extraordinary violence when they believe their authority is threatened. The Bengali famine, hunger in the shadow of war. During the Second World War, another catastrophe unfolded across British India. In 1943, Bengali descended into famine. Food prices soared, supply chains broke down, millions found themselves unable to obtain basic necessities. Villages emptied, families sold possessions simply to survive. Children wandered cities' streets searching for food. Corpses appeared along roadsides. By the time the famine subsided, millions were dead. The causes remain debated by historians. Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia disrupted regional food supplies. Wartime transportation systems struggled. Inflation intensified suffering. At the same time, British wartime policies and decisions had been heavily criticized for worsening conditions and failing to provide adequate relief. For many Indians, the famine became a symbol of colonial indifference, a disaster in which millions died while imperial priorities remained focused elsewhere. The image of starvation would haunt the final years of British rule. Mao's China. Revolution on a continental scale. In 1949, after decades of civil war and foreign invasion, the Chinese Communist Party emerged victorious. The world's most populous nation, entered a new era. To supporters, the revolution promised liberation, an end to exploitation, an end to foreign domination, a new society built on equality. But transforming a nation of hundreds of millions would prove extraordinarily costly. Under Mao Zedong, China embarked on a series of massive social and economic experiments. None would prove more devastating than the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward, when ambition became disaster. Beginning in 1958, Mao sought to rapidly transform China into an industrial powerhouse. Agriculture was reorganized, communes were recreated, production targets became increasingly unrealistic. Local officials often exaggerated harvest numbers to satisfy superiors. The state collected grain based on those inflated reports. The consequences were catastrophic. Food disappeared from villages. Famine spread across vast regions. Entire communities starved. Parents watched children die. Children watched parents collapse from hunger. Millions perished. The exact death toll remains debated, but it ranks among the deadliest famines in human history. Unlike many natural disasters, this catastrophe emerged largely from policy decisions, political pressure, and the inability of the system to acknowledge failure. The tragedy demonstrated how ideology can become dangerous when leaders become insulated from reality. Indonesia, the anti-communist purge. In 1965, Indonesia entered one of the bloodiest episodes of the Cold War. Following a failed coup attempt, the government and military launched a massive campaign against suspected communists. What followed was not a conventional war. It was a nationwide purge. Political activists, labor organizers, intellectuals, ethnic Chinese communities, anyone suspected of communist sympathies could become a target. Across the archipelago, killings spread rapidly. Mass arrests followed. Entire communities lived in fear. The death toll remained uncertain, but hundreds of thousands were killed. Many more were imprisoned for years. The violence transformed Indonesian society and remains one of the largest political massacres of the 20th century. East Timor, a forgotten occupation. In 1975, East Timor declared independence. Within days, Indonesian forces invaded. The occupation that followed lasted decades. Military operations, displacement, famine, and political oppression devastated the population. Entire villages were relocated. Civilians found themselves trapped between resistance movements and military campaigns. For years, the conflict received relatively little international attention. Yet, for East Timorese communities, it became one of the defining tragedies of modern history. If the Great Leap Forward revealed the dangers of ideological certainty, Cambodia would reveal how far revolutionary extremism could go. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge seized power under Pol Pot. Their vision was radical. They sought to erase the old society completely. Cities were emptied, money was abolished, religion was suppressed, schools were closed, millions were forced into agricultural labor. Anyone associated with education, government, religion, or perceived foreign influence became suspect. Teachers, doctors, engineers, students, even wearing glasses could attract suspicion. The regime sought to create a perfect revolutionary society. Instead, it created a nightmare. Execution spread, starvation became widespread, disease flourished, families were separated, children were recruited into the revolutionary system. By the time the Khmer Rouge fell, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population had perished. The Cambodian Genocide remains one of history's starkest examples of ideological fanaticism unleashed without restraint. Bangladesh, a nation born in blood. In 1971, tensions between East and West Pakistani erupted into war. The conflict quickly expanded beyond a struggle for political autonomy. Mass violence spread across East Pakistan, which would later become Bangladesh. Civilians were targeted, intellectuals were attacked, entire communities suffered displacement and massacre. Millions fled as refugees into neighboring India. The war eventually ended with the creation of Bangladesh, but the cost was immense. The conflict left deep scars that continue to shape regional memories and politics. My Lai, the village that changed the war. During the Vietnam War, another atrocity shocked the world. In March 1968, American soldiers entered the village of My Lai. What followed became one of the most infamous incidents of the conflict. Civilians were killed. Women, children, and elderly villagers were among the victims. The massacre challenged official narratives about the war. When details became public, it fueled growing opposition to the conflict both in the United States and abroad. My Lai demonstrated that atrocities are not confined to dictatorships or authoritarian regimes. Under conditions of fear, stress, dehumanization, and war, even professional militaries can commit horrific acts. The lesson was uncomfortable, but it was impossible to ignore. Africa, when colonial borders became fault lines. By the late 20th century, much of Africa had formerly escaped colonial rule. European empires had retreated, new flags were raised, new governments were formed, independence was celebrated across the continent as a historic turning point. But political independence did not erase the structures left behind. Colonial borders remained. Ethnic groups had been divided or forced together inside artificial states. Economic systems were still heavily dependent on extraction, and newly formed governments inherited fragile institutions built for control, not stability. In many regions, the pressure that followed independence did not resolve old tensions, they intensified them. And in some cases, they erupted into some of the most devastating genocides and mass atrocities of the 20th century. The Belgian Congo, extraction without limits. Under the rule of the Belgian colonial administration, the Congo became one of the most brutally exploited territories in Africa. What was presented as development and modernization was, in practice, an extraction economy driven by rubber, minerals, and labor. Villages were required to meet production quotas. Failure to meet demands often resulted in punishment. Communities were displaced. Labor was coerced. Violence was used to enforce compliance. Families were separated by economic pressure and forced labor systems. Entire regions became shaped by the demands of external markets rather than local needs. When the Congo eventually gained independence in 1960, it did so with deep structural instability already embedded within its political and economic systems. The legacy of extraction would continue to shape this country long after colonial rule ended. Namibia, the first genocide of the 20th century. At the beginning of the century, German colonial forces carried out one of the earliest genocides of modern history in what is now Namibia. Herero and Nama communities resisted colonial expansion and land seizure. The response was overwhelmingly military force. Survivors were pushed into the desert. Access to water sources was restricted. Many died from starvation and dehydration. Others were placed in concentration camps under brutal conditions. Their violence marked a grim precedent, the use of systematic extermination policies within a colonial framework. Long before the atrocities of World War II, the mechanisms of modern genocide were already being tested in Africa. Rwanda, the speed of collapse. In 1994, Rwanda became the site of one of the fastest and most intense genocides in modern history. Decades of ethnic tensions between Hutu and Tutsi populations had been intensified by colonial classification systems and post-independence political struggles. Decades of ethnic tensions between Hutu and Tutsi populations had been intensified by colonial classification systems and post-independence political struggles. When political instability escalated, extremist forces began preparing for mass violence. Then, in a matter of days, the genocide began. Roadblocks appeared across the country. Radio broadcasts encouraged participation in killings. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Entire communities were destroyed at extraordinary speed. In just around 100 days, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The scale and speed of the violence stunned the world. International response was limited and often delayed. When intervention came, it was largely too late to prevent the majority of the killings. Rwanda demonstrated one of the most disturbing realities of the 20th century. Genocide does not always unfold slowly. Sometimes it accelerates with terrifying speed. South America, when disappearances became policy. By the final decades of the 20th century, the world had become deeply interconnected. Cold War rivalries stretched across continents. Intelligence agencies operated globally. Economic systems were tied together through trade, finance, and resource extraction. And while Europe and Asia had already endured the worst of the century's mass killings, the Western Hemisphere was not spared. In Latin America, a different form of violence emerged, less often framed as genocide in the traditional sense, but no less devastating in its human cost. It was a violence of secrecy, of disappearances, of prisons without trials, of bodies that never returned home. Military dictatorships, revolutionary wars, and counterinsurgency campaigns reshaped entire societies. And in the shadows, hundreds of thousands of civilians would vanish. The Guatemalan Genocide. In Guatemala, decades of civil conflict between government forces and leftist insurgencies escalated into brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. Indigenous Mayan communities, particularly in rural highland regions, were frequently caught in the crossfire. In many areas, entire villages were targeted under suspicion of supporting guerrilla groups. Military operations involved mass killings, village destructions, and forced displacement. The violence was not only military, it was cultural. Communities with deep historical roots were uprooted. Languages, traditions, and ways of life came under threat alongside the people themselves. The conflict left hundreds of thousands dead or displaced. For many survivors, the trauma extended far beyond the end of the war. It reshaped the identity of entire regions. Argentina. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Argentina entered a period known as the Dirty War. Following political instability, a military junta took control of the state. Under the guise of fighting subversion, security forces carried out a widespread campaign of repression. People suspected of opposition activity were detained without trial. Many were taken in secret. They were never seen again. These individuals became known as the disappeared. Estimates suggest tens of thousands vanished during this period. Prisoners were often unofficial. Detention centers were hidden. Families were left searching for answers that never came. The psychological impact of disappearance became one of the defining features of the era. Not knowing became its own form of suffering. In Chile, the overthrow of a democratically elected government in 1973 led to another military dictatorship. Under Augusto Pinochet, political opposition was systematically repressed. Detentions, tortures, and disappearances became tools of governance. Prisoners were held in secret facilities. Many were executed. Others were permanently disappeared. The state justified its actions as necessary for national security stability. The state justified its actions as necessary for national security and stability. But for thousands of families, it meant years of uncertainty and loss. Chile became another example of how Cold War politics often transformed internal conflicts into global ideological battlegrounds. Brazil. In Brazil, military rule beginning in 1964 led to censorship, political repression, and targeted persecution of opposition groups. Indigenous populations were also deeply affected by state-led development projects, which often resulted in displacement, disease exposure, and land loss. Infrastructure expansion into the Amazon region disrupted isolated communities, some of which had little or no prior contact with the outside world. While Brazil did not experience mass killing on the same scale as some neighboring conflicts, the period remains marked by systemic repression and human rights violation. Paraguay and Chaco legacy. The Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay in the 1930s devastated both nations. Though predating many Cold War atrocities, its consequences continued into later decades. Military mobilization, disease, and harsh environmental conditions caused widespread suffering. Indigenous populations were often disproportionately affected, both during and after the conflict. As states expanded control over frontier regions, the war demonstrated how resource competition and nationalism in Latin America often intersected with long-term structural violence. Bolivia. In Bolivia, labor strikes and political unrest were met at times with violent suppression. Events such as the Catavi Massacre and the San Juan Massacre reflected tensions between mining communities, labor movements, and state authority. Industrial workers demanding rights often found themselves in direct conflict with military or police forces. The mining sector, central to Bolivia's economy, became both a site of economic dependence and political confrontation. Mexico and Chiapas, the weight of internal conflict. In Mexico, long-standing regional inequalities and political tensions periodically erupted into violence. In Chiapas, indigenous communities faced land disputes, economic marginalization, and political repression. While not always classified under a single unified event, cycles of violence in the region reflected broader patterns seen across Latin America. Land inequality, state authority versus local autonomy, indigenous rights struggles, militarized responses to dissent. These tensions occasionally escalated into massacres and forced displacement, leaving lasting scars on rural communities. The Putumayo Genocide in the Amazon basin. In the Amazon region spanning Peru and Colombia, rubber extraction industries at the turn of the century and into the early 20th century created systems of forced labor and extreme violence against indigenous populations. Communities were coerced into rubber production and under brutal conditions. Punishment for failure to meet quotas were severe. Entire groups were decimated through a combination of violence, disease, and exploitation. Although earlier than many Cold War events, its legacy persisted in how extractive economies continued to impact indigenous populations across the region. It stands as one of the clearest examples of how resource demands can translate into human destruction. The Dominican Republic and Haiti border violence. In 1937, the Trujillo regime in Dominican Republic carried out mass killings of Haitian migrants and Haitian-descended populations along the border. Known historically as the Parsley Massacre, represented one of the most severe ethnic violence events in Caribbean history. It highlighted how racial and national identity could be weaponized even in relatively small-scale border disputes. The legacy of the massacre continued to influence Dominican-Haitian relations for decades. A world that learned too much power too quickly. Across 6 continents, the 20th century revealed a consistent and disturbing truth. Genocide was not confined to one ideology, not limited to one region, not the product of one culture or one political system. It appeared under empires and republics, under fascism, communism, colonialism, nationalism, and revolution. It emerged in moments of war, famine, instability, and rapid transformation. In nearly every case, the same patterns returned: dehumanization, fear, political certainty, institutional power, and the belief that suffering could be justified for a greater goal. By the end of the century, humanity had built the most technologically advanced civilization in history. Yet, it had also demonstrated something far darker: that modern systems, when stripped of accountability, can scale both progress and destruction with equal efficiency. The 20th century did not invent genocide, but revealed how easily it could be repeated, at scale, across continents, again and again. And the final question it leaves behind is not historical, it is human. If civilization can build systems capable of connecting the entire world, it can also build systems capable of protecting it from itself.